Hello and welcome to today's lesson. I hope you've learnt about the advantages of international trade in your previous non-plasma lesson. In today's lesson, we will discuss the basis of international trade, which is the theory of absolute cost difference by Adam Smith. This theory is also known as theory of absolute advantage. But first, let me ask you to do an activity. This is what I want you to do. Discuss what you think is the theory of absolute cost difference as a base for international trade with the student sitting next to you. Have you discussed the theory of absolute cost difference? I hope so. Let's discuss the answer together. According to the theory of absolute cost difference or theory of absolute advantage, the fundamental base for international trade is the difference in absolute cost. An absolute cost difference arises when one country, say country X, can produce a commodity, say wheat, at a lower cost compared to another country. And the other country, say country Y, can produce some other commodity, say tractors, at a lower cost compared to the first country. Thus, an absolute cost difference arises when each of the two countries can produce some commodities at an absolutely lower production cost than the other. Students, now I want you to discuss factors that contribute to absolute cost difference in production process between countries. Do this activity in groups. Did you discuss the question? That's very good. In a moment, I will list some of the factors that contribute to absolute cost difference between countries. Some of the factors that contribute to absolute cost difference between countries are the climatic condition, the type of soil, the human resources, and the technology that each country has. Adam Smith, the famous economist, argued that a country tends to specialize in producing a particular commodity which it can produce at an absolutely lower cost and exports it to other countries. On the other hand, it tends to import the other commodities which it produces at a higher cost. Students, let me give you an illustration to elaborate the concept of the theory of absolute cost difference or theory of absolute advantage using hypothetical example of two countries and two commodities. The table shows two countries, Ethiopia and India, producing two commodities, coffee and wheat. The figures in the table indicate the productivity of one laborer in one day. That is, a laborer in India produces 4 units of coffee and 8 units of wheat per day, whereas a laborer in Ethiopia produces 8 units of coffee and 4 units of wheat per day. Based on the figure, in India, wheat is produced at lower cost compared to coffee production, whereas in Ethiopia, coffee is produced at lower cost compared to wheat production. This implies that India has absolute advantage in producing wheat and absolute disadvantage in producing coffee. On the other hand, Ethiopia has absolute advantage in producing coffee and an absolute disadvantage in producing wheat. Therefore, in this case, Adam Smith's theory of absolute cost difference would suggest that international trade would benefit both countries based on specialization along their absolute advantage. That is, the theory suggests that India would specialize in the production of wheat and export it to Ethiopia in exchange for coffee. On the other hand, Ethiopia would specialize in the production of coffee and export it to India in exchange for wheat. I hope you've understood the concept of absolute advantage or absolute cost difference as a base for international trade. Now, I want you to do an exercise individually. The question is, identify the absolute advantage and absolute disadvantage of the two countries, India and Sudan, in producing two commodities, clothes and shoes, based on the following table. Did you answer the question? I hope so. Now compare your answer with what I'm going to describe in a second. The table shows that in India, a laborer requires 2 hours to produce 1 meter of cloth and 5 hours to produce a pair of shoes, whereas a laborer in Sudan requires 5 hours to produce 1 meter of cloth and 2 hours to produce 1 pair of shoes. Based on the figure, in India, cloth is produced at lesser time or cost when compared to shoe production, whereas in Sudan, shoes is produced at lesser time or cost when compared to cloth production. Accordingly, India has absolute advantage in producing cloth and absolute disadvantage in producing shoes. Contrary, Sudan has absolute advantage in producing shoes and an absolute disadvantage in producing cloth. Students, based on the previous table, write down how India and Sudan should engage in international trade so that both countries benefit from trade. Do the activity individually. I hope you've attempted the question. Compare your answer with the following. International trade would benefit both countries based on specialization along their absolute advantage. That is, India would specialize in the production of cloth and export it to Sudan in exchange for shoes. On the other hand, Sudan would specialize in the production of shoes and export it to India in exchange for cloth. Students, in today's lesson, we have learnt about the basis of international trade, that is the theory of absolute cost difference theorized by Adam Smith. Let me now wind up what we have discussed so far. According to the theory of absolute cost difference or theory of absolute advantage, the fundamental base for international trade is the difference in absolute cost, which could be caused by a number of factors such as climate, soil type, human resources, and technology. As a result of absolute cost difference, trade would be mutually beneficial if a country specializes in producing a particular commodity which it can produce at an absolutely lower cost and exports it to other countries and at the same time import the other commodity which it produces at a higher cost. Students, this brings us to the end of today's lesson. In your next plasma lesson, you will learn about the basis of international trade, that is Theory of Comparative Cost by David Ricardo. Until then, goodbye teacher, goodbye students.